Greenland ice is melting faster than anyone had thought, and that's a bad thing globally. I'm meteorologist Don Paul. Welcome to my podcast, Don Paul's Bits o' Blather on Weather and Climate. It had been estimated that Greenland had lost 5,000 gigatons of ice to fresh meltwater, and that's been over several decades, which, if you could refreeze the meltwater, would cover the state of Texas to a depth of 26 feet of ice. An interesting sight to just imagine. Turns out that was 20% shy of the actual ice melt, and that there is an additional 1,000 gigatons of ice which has melted, which would bring that ice depth up to 31 feet in Texas. But this isn't just a scenario for you to picture such a thing. It is a reality and it spells trouble. First of all, you have these vast quantities of fresh water being dumped into the world's oceans, primarily from Greenland, but also from other glaciers in the high latitudes and the Antarctic ice shelf over the land, now sliding into the ocean. And this rate of water increase coming off the land is increasing the rate of sea level rises, which now often result in lunar monthly tidal flooding unrelated to ocean storms and their storm surges. That's one impact. The amount of sea level rise, if warming continues unabated, will come to the point where tens of millions of people will have to move away from their current home locations on the coastal floodplains around the globe. The other impact is all this fresh water being dumped into the high latitude North Atlantic is diluting the salinity of those waters. That's critical. Saltier water is heavier water, and it sinks to the ocean's bottom and then flows toward the world's equator before overturning and returning in a great conveyor current within which is the warming Gulf Stream. And we know that this current has collapsed in the past history of the Earth over the last few 100,000 years several times. The evidence is irrefutable that this has happened, and that was unrelated to human activity. What's happening now is our ongoing warming, which has accelerated in recent decades, is due to us. No, I don't mean just the United States. We're talking about the continued burning of fossil fuels and the kinds of agricultural technology adding greenhouse gases from all the industrialized nations and many developing nations, which has continued to increase the rate of global warming fastest in the high latitudes. And with this change in salinity in the high latitudes, that current is already showing signs of slowing down and moving toward a tipping point, the exact dimensions of which are still unknown, but we do know we're getting closer to it. And if the salinity drops off enough, this current can once again collapse. And this is at a time in the Earth's history where the Earth should be cooling based on its orbital eccentricities over cycles that take tens of thousands of years. The only reason the world is warming now is due to human activity. And the only way we can forestall the collapse of this current, or at least the increased likelihood of that collapse, is to slow the rate of global warming. And we know this is something that's achievable. It's a question of whether we will achieve it. The amount of cooling which would result from a current collapse may sound to some like, oh, that'll just be nature's way of balancing things out, right? No, wrong. The amount of cooling which has occurred during past collapses of this conveyor current was drastic, and as bad as the impacts from global warming are and will continue to be, the impacts from the cooling will outweigh the impacts from the warming. It will not just be a balancing act. The best estimates are that the collapse of the current could cause a mean temperature drop off over Western and Northern Europe of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in just several decades, up to a century. That's 9 to 15 degrees cooler Fahrenheit, where right now the rate of warming is about 2/10 of 1 degree Celsius per decade. You get the difference in the balance of those numbers. Similar losses in heat could be expected over many parts of eastern North America. The cooling would be in a collapse of this current so drastic that population support would drop off very quickly in northern and western Europe for agriculture, and overall support of the populations currently in place. So, again, this is not nature's balancing act. This is something worse than what we already have, tied to what we already have. And so, because there are several studies which have come out on this approach of a tipping point, you may want to gain more information than I can give you here on a podcast. If you go to climate.nasa.gov, you can find on that excellent website a summary of these new studies on the approach of this tipping point and the loss of Greenland ice. It is a critical subject for anyone interested in the negative impacts that are already in place and future worse impacts from climate change. Thanks for listening. Please share, please follow. I'll talk to you again real soon.